Hello, I'm Nikhil.
And I'm Shankar. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 28. Me or we? How do we balance family and friends?
I love that question, Shankar, and we'll get to that later in the episode. But just to give some context, we are in the middle of our series on individualism versus collectivism. We've talked about our experiences growing up in individual and collective spaces, and the idea of having privacy across generations, especially with our parents.
Yes, if you haven't listened to the previous two parts and didn't hear Nikhil's advice to me on using Instagram, you can go back and check out episodes 26 and 27. And Nikhil, I haven't done anything dangerous on Instagram yet.
Good to hear, Shankar.
Although I have set up some tutorials from my daughter in the coming weeks on how to use
Oh,
it. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
Tutorial.
yeah.
Are those publicly available to our listeners too?
I don't think you want to see me, in my early stages, but once I've, a little better, you'll see the products.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
And even if you haven't heard those previous episodes, you can also just jump into this conversation since it covers different topics related to individual versus collective space.
So, on today's episode, you'll hear us chat about the challenges of navigating emotional space with our parents, the different perceptions of how much time we spend between family versus friends across generations, and some of the benefit of building guilt free relationships.
We'll come back at the end to wrap things up. Here we go. The growth of an individual and from childhood to adolescence to an adult necessarily involves their exploring spaces which maybe they're not always comfortable sharing with their parents.
Right.
Does that make sense? And so, digital is
It
another
does.
dimension.
It does.
that.
It does. The other thing I say to expand this topic a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just with parents,
Mhm.
but also with relatives,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
especially if you grow up in this country,
Right.
in the sense that I was always aware,
Mm-hmm.
not only, okay, what are my parents saying on social media,
Mhm.
but what are the aunties and uncles or grandparents or whoever in India who might be following me
Right.
seeing in India?
Right.
Because there's
That's
a little
right.
bit of
There's
a, oh, who's that?
difference. Yeah.
And in particular, what I was most sensitive to
Mm-hmm.
is if I appeared in a photo
Mm-hmm.
with a girl,
Yeah.
right? Especially a one-on-one photo or whatever,
Right.
which might be, in my case, was totally innocuous or innocent and didn't mean anything.
Mhm.
But if that photo shows up,
Right.
let's say two people are smiling in the photo,
Right.
you know,
Should we booking
Some-
the Kalyan
say,
Mandapam?
some relative in India might see it and say,
Yeah.
hey, what's going on? And
Yeah.
that starts up a phone call, that starts up conversation, and then you have to answer to it later.
Yeah.
So I was very aware of being photographed in bigger groups
Yeah. That's interesting.
or individually versus in smaller groups.
Ah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My gosh.
I know, it's
Yeah.
a whole thing. You have to think a lot about it. Or at least I did. Maybe it might be different. I'd be curious to hear from our listeners too what
Right.
they did.
Right.
Like you said, it's a form of information
Mhm.
gathering or information sharing,
Mhm.
unintentional or not. I do think too the other thing about private space is, at least in the digital space,
Mhm.
you kind of have to have a set policy.
Mhm.
Meaning, if you start friending parents
Mhm.
and that first cousin,
Mhm.
you better be ready to friend the rest of them.
Right.
Because then it leads to questions of like, why am I allowed to see your profile? Why does this cousin allowed to see your profile? The other cousin might say, wait a minute,
Right.
why am I not allowed to? You know, it's.
Right.
I think it's a little bit challenging. So you either have, in my opinion,
Mhm.
it's simpler to say either, you know what,
No one or
this set of folks, however
Mhm.
they're related to you,
Mhm.
I'm just gonna say no,
everyone.
or I'm gonna let them all in.
Mhm.
When there's a pick and choose, it might lead to some friction or tension.
Right. Oh, this is very enlightening for me, Nikhil, as I embark on my journey into uncharted
Exactly.
waters
So
on the
yeah,
digital plane.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Let me ask you this:
Mhm.
private space.
Mhm.
What about emotional space?
Oh wow, that's a powerful one.
Yeah, between parents and children in particular, but
Right.
between generations, how do we think about space from an emotional perspective?
Yeah, that's a very very pertinent question, and I think that if you ask me, if that space is not treated with respect, it can be I believe, the source of a lot of intergenerational trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
So, for instance, especially a child has a very sensitive incident, and that emotional space, how it is respected, treated, um, permitted, or denied, right, or negated, or trivialized, can make it very hurtful
Mm-hmm.
down the line. So that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also thinking about as a child,
Mm-hmm.
if you're experiencing some type of emotional hardship,
Right.
and you feel like you can handle it yourself, or
Mm-hmm.
let's say as a teenager, more.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a teenager and you think, oh, I'm going through this hard thing, I'm just gonna handle it
Mm-hmm.
myself. But let's say your parents are thinking, I need to help them with this.
Mm.
I don't want to see my kids suffer.
Right.
I don't want to see them be sad.
Right.
And so you push a little bit, or
Mhm.
you probe a little bit.
Mhm.
I guess that's where I see private space questions come into
Oh,
be contested, really,
right.
right? Is, hey, what's wrong? I want to help you.
Mm.
I'm here to help you. Versus, I need my space.
Yeah, and I honestly think maybe the answer. I'll try to propose a strategy forward. I think eventually we all want to develop emotional resilience
Mm-hmm.
as adults, which means that we are not going to run away from things that provide emotionally sensitive triggers to us, right? If we try to protect ourselves all the time from anything emotional, we are going to be complete disasters in a social space.
Mm.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Right. But we have to acknowledge that we're going to react to them, and we have to find a strategy to respond to them in a healthy way.
Yes.
Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
So I think when parents try to be overprotective, so one extreme is, I don't want my child to feel anything bad. That's kind of ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you go back to what I feel may happen a lot in traditional societies, that go out there, get whacked around, and you'll be fine, right?
Yeah.
You'll only build immunity if you get
Yeah.
beat up.
Right.
Is not a good example. I mean, that's what justifies a lot of bullying and ragging, that it will build character. But if you don't provide the tools to make that person emotionally resilient, that doesn't mean, like I said, protecting them from everything.
Mhm.
It means actually letting them have those interactions, but then coming back, having a space to recognize what they are. How do you deal with it? How do you cope with this in a healthy way? How do you, in some cases, push back maybe? Or how do you protect yourself? I think if those behaviors are not taught, you can have two extremes. One is somebody who gets traumatized and is kind of scarred, or on the other hand, someone who's so protected and so sensitive that even if you say one thing, they're going to just collapse, and that's the end of the world. And I think parents are maybe need a lot of self growth in learning to walk that tightrope to
Right.
find balance.
Yeah. And I think this ties back to how we were raised.
Mhm.
Because if we look at parents,
Right.
today's generation of parents, they may not have had much emotional space with
Yeah,
their parents.
that's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're growing up in a household where you're sharing the bedroom, there's one bedroom for the whole family,
Yeah.
or whatever else. You literally don't have the physical space to process
Yeah.
your own challenges. It's always communal.
Yeah.
Then when you have a kid, and let's say you live in America and you have a 3-bedroom house,
Right.
you still might have that instinct of, oh, I see this person struggling.
Right.
I'm here to help. Let me lean in. Versus that kid might be thinking, hey,
Yeah.
I don't need your help right now, or
Right.
I'm feeling overwhelmed or
Right.
flooded.
Mm-hmm.
I need to focus on this first, and I'll pull you in for help.
Yeah.
It's a different model.
That's a fantastic, that's very perceptive, Nikhil. Actually, the way I think you articulated the problem in a much clearer way
Mm-hmm.
as to how it's experienced in America than I did.
Mm.
So
I built on what you said, so I couldn't have gotten there without your framing.
You're being generous, I think. So, but then the question of what are the resources that this person who's feeling flooded or wants to keep that private emotional space, what resources, other resources do they have?
Right.
And how can parents contain that natural tendency to jump in and help?
Right. And I think within private space, there's also a factor
Mm-hmm.
of what other parties are allowed in that private space.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, family versus friends.
Mm-hmm.
Huge distinction.
Right.
Having immigrants and the children of immigrants
Mm-hmm.
figure out what their relationships are to family versus friends and their obligations to family versus friends,
Right.
I think is a huge part of the immigrant experience.
Yeah.
Meaning, when I was growing up,
Mhm.
obligation was to family first,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And sometimes when you then go out to see your friends,
Mhm.
there's a question like, do you really need to see your friends?
Mhm.
Is this really what you want to do? Do
Wow.
you really not want to be here with us doing something?
Yeah.
I remember there was once when uh, my family used to do New Year's together. We
Mhm.
would always bring the New Year together. And one year, I think it was my 10th or 11th grade, 12th grade, something like that. I decided as a teenager to go celebrate New Year's with my friends.
Yeah.
And my parents let me do it, but
Right.
they were kind of upset about it.
Mhm.
They were sad about it.
Right.
And they couldn't really understand it.
Yeah.
You know, it was kind of, wait, why wouldn't you want to be with your family on New Year's? You're bringing in the New Year together.
Yeah.
But to me, at that point, I
Yeah.
needed some space,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Yeah.
And I needed to say, we've done this many years over. And this year in particular, I think that year in particular, I felt closer to my friends at that point.
Right.
Which, to be honest, if you told family I'm feeling closer to my friends than to you, that's
hurtful.
That's hurtful, yeah. Although maybe we should destigmatize it a bit, because there are times when we'll be closer to other people in our lives. But I remember feeling that tension a bit, and my parents were respectful. Although I did remember thinking later that night at the New Year's party, kind of, oh, I kind of wish I was with my family. So I learned a little bit about myself and have adjusted how I spend my New Year's in more recent years.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this. How do we allow kids to find other connections and friends, and how does that impact our private space with our kids?
It might surprise you to know that we face the same thing in our generation as well. Yeah.
Really?
It's not completely unique.
With your parents?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, it's always this negotiation, like summer holidays and stuff like that. That was a bigger thing. So in summer holidays, we'd get time off from college. And I think my parents implicitly expected me that every summer holiday I'd be there with them. And after a while, it started to chafe a little bit. I would get bored. And my friends seemed to be doing other interesting things. And so there was that tension. And I think it's part of the tension of growing up into becoming an adult. Like I give you this metaphor of, the little bird in a nest. And I told you that in some species, they literally kick the little bird out so that it learns to fly as it falls out of the nest. And I think we have to balance the support with challenge, to use a coaching analogy.
Yes, this is something we've been studying this week, so that's why I'm laughing.
Right, I know. It's a loaded code word.
Yeah, exactly.
In our
been doing a lot of support with challenge
profession. But I actually feel that with I even think about that in the context of interacting with my daughter, which is I want her to go out and experience other things with other people.
Right.
But then we also want more time with her. We want to have these quality experiences. And I think on balance, I've been able to strike a boundary or a space of where she, I think, feels comfortable. And it doesn't feel constrained. It doesn't feel like your parents want you more than you want to be with your friends.
Right.
But I mean, you have to ask her, of course, about that.
Yeah.
But I think it's true. And on the flip side, I did feel when I was growing up that there was greater expectation that I should be around family than with friends. And I don't think there's any right answer. I think as we grow up, as you become an adult, you're still going to negotiate this with your spouse.
Yeah.
You see this, like in America, I know that many couples will say we'll do Thanksgiving with one family and Christmas with the other family. This is the two big festivals, and they make choices. Like you can't have everything with both families.
Sure.
So once you get married, you're going to negotiate that.
Yeah.
So at some level, we're always negotiating with every other person on this planet that we want to be close, but we also have some limits on our time.
Right.
And how do we do that without hurting the other person?
Yeah. I agree with you. I would challenge you.
Okay. Otherwise it'd be too easy, right?
I would challenge you in that if we just look at parents and kids,
right.
I would like to see parents be more open to kids having strong friendships.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even at the expense sometimes of family closeness.
Yeah.
Because that's how you build resilience. Maybe I'm overgeneralizing, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when I think about South Asian parents of your generation, I think there's a little bit of a reluctance.
On balance, South Asian parents are more clingy than American parents. Let's say it out there. Yes or no? It's true, right?
I guess so. Yeah, I think that it's not a resentment
Right.
to see friends, but it almost there's a sadness, right? Like so often growing up for me and my friends to say like, "Hey, I'm gonna go hang out with my friends."
Guilt.
That is a request,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of like, "Oh, you don't want to hang out with us?"
Right.
Like it is seen kind of zero sum. Like
Yeah, but it's a breeding ground for guilt.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Think about it. It is.
Say more about that.
Well, I think that if I make you feel hurt, that by your going away, you're hurting me, you're going to feel guilty about it. And
Yeah.
that's not a basis for a healthy relationship down the line.
Right. Yeah.
Hard though it is to swallow in that
Right.
instant.
Right.
So if you want a guilt-free relationship with your kids, you got to negotiate that.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you agree about this idea of parents of your generation feeling this way about friends, or have you seen more of a variety?
I think on my personal experience has been that on balance, even in my own, even as a parent myself, that probably we were more reluctant to allow that kind of interaction. It was more family based, home based.
Right.
But as I became aware of it, at least I'm able to now rationally explain this point to you, and then hopefully in time it will, I think it is already translated.
Yeah, I think times are changing.
But naming it, right? The first thing is you have to name what you're doing when you're doing that.
Right.
So if you really want a healthy, guilt-free relationship, you got to be honest and sensible about it.
Yeah. Here's a big question.
Yeah.
How many of the generational relationships in our community do you think are guilt-based?
I think there are a lot of them, right? To some extent, yeah.
I think so.
I would argue.
It might be also beyond our community, to be fair. It could just be in general.
Oh, I think it is fairly
How
general.
many? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's even specific to South Asia.
Right.
Right. Guilt is a pretty universal phenomenon.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool.
It is.
It's a powerful force.
To ensure compliance.
Yeah.
But I think there's the flip side of it is probably that's also too much of an idealization that you can have any guilt-free relationship. Probably all relationships have a little bit of guilt. Maybe a small amount is healthy and it's okay.
Yeah.
So that wraps up the third part of our conversation on individualism versus collectivism. What are you taking away from the conversation, Nikhil?
Wow, Shankar, this whole idea of the obligation to our family versus our friends and the guilt that can be attached to spending time with family versus friends, it just resonates with me really, really deeply. And I hope it's something we can come to a better relationship with in our community. The other thing I was touched by in this episode is, emotional space. And I actually chatted with one of our listeners who shared a story where, on an earlier episode, we talked about having collective space for families to grow up versus individual space, right? And this listener had shared this story with me about how, as a kid growing up in India, they had 2 bedrooms for 2 kids. They actually chose to have this listener and his brother stay in the same room, live in the same room, and then use the other room for work, rather than having a separate room, a separate bedroom for each child. And I just found that so interesting because sometimes we assume the constraints on emotional space or physical space are physical, right? You don't have enough space for all these people. But sometimes these choices happen just from a family stance. Like the family, I think in this case, might have believed it's better to have a shared emotional space than a shared physical space between brothers, even though we have 2 rooms. So they'll have 1 room for sleep and 1 room for work. So I've been thinking about that too. Yeah, go ahead.
A functional division of space, right?
Yeah.
Rather than physical division.
Right. Which also goes back to obligation to family, right? Like, what do you owe your family in that space? Those were all kind of coming together in my head with this episode.
Yeah, very interesting. And it just seems to me also a fundamental difference of how we may view space itself, right? So, as a family unit, you have each space designated for a particular function rather than each person have their own space.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well said.
Right.
What are you taking away, Shankar?
Oh gosh, a lot. That is a very poignant piece for me. And when I say that is the bit about making the choice of whether you're going to spend time and give attention and energy to family obligations or to friends. And I think it brings up a lot of, difficult situations, difficult choices. And I still admire, and I know there are people who seem to navigate both seamlessly.
Mm-hmm.
And how they do it is truly an art.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, preserving their individuality and their choice, but yet not hurting anyone or flouting something in a way. I think it's an art form. I have not mastered it at all.
Yeah. I mean, from a distance, I'd say you do some of that pretty well, but I think we can certainly learn from people who are really good at this, and maybe it's one we revisit in a future episode.
Yeah, I think from a distance is key, is the key phrase there. There's a saying that the mountains are distant because they're far away. They're so far away. I mean, they're pretty because they're so far away.
Yeah.
Right.
That's fair.
That's what I meant.
Right.
Yeah. So I think when you look at things closely, we always see, or when we look at a mirror, we see those challenges. But maybe you're right. Maybe everyone has, but I think there's a skill set there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something to be learned.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So to our dear listeners, you can reach out to us on our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or our email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating or a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
See you all next time.